Welcome everyone, I'm Tina Panic from the Avon Library. We are here to launch our Unearthing History series, and I just want to run through the housekeeping for the evening before I turn it over to one of our co-hosts, Terry Wilson from the Historical Society, who will then walk us through our fantastic bios of our presenters, and then we'll have a lovely presentation. The format for today will be the lecture itself. You can post questions in the Q&A box at any time. We will answer them at the end. When we finish the formal presentation, we'll announce that so that if you need to leave, you can, and then we'll do the questions for as long as we're able. We will record this and it will be posted on our Avon Library YouTube channel, and we will email it out to all of the participants. You'll notice there's a transcription feature at the bottom of the screen for those who need it. Those who don't want to can hover at the bottom of the screen and turn it off. You'll also notice the chat feature is disabled, and that's just for less distraction because we have a very large audience this evening. Okay, I'd like to now turn it over to Terry Wilson to introduce our guests.
Thank you, Tina. Good evening. On behalf of the Avon Historical Society, the Avon Library, the Avon Senior Center, our Avon Town Historian, and the Planning Committee for Unearthing History, I welcome you to what we hope will be an educational and informative series of events this year. We also thank the Farmington Bank Community Foundation for a grant to make all of this possible. I'd like to recognize the Planning Committee who assisted Tina, Jen, and me to put this all together. Mark Banks, a local archaeologist who was part of the discovery team, Nancy Najarian from the Institute for American Indian Studies in Washington, Connecticut, Howard Wright, geology teacher at Renbrook School and our presenter in April, and Becky Saul from the Farmington River Watershed Association. All are on with us this evening. As some of you may know, the discovery of the Brian Jones Paleo-Indian site along the Farmington River in Avon happened in early 2019. In February of 2020, we held the first public presentation about it at the Avon Senior Center. While state and local archaeologists knew for decades that there was something very special 6 feet down at that site, it took federal and state regulations mandating a survey of the area before the State Department of Transportation could build the new bridge there. Tonight, we launched the first of 5 events to break down the information for the general public about this 12,500-year-old site. This human occupation site is named for Brian Jones, the state archaeologist who suspected that there was something very special deep down and was able to see much of it before his untimely death in July of 2019. During this year, we will explore the geology, anthropology, the river, and other paleo sites in Connecticut. We will end the series in October with a detailed update on the 3-year analysis of the 15,000 artifacts found there. It will be a joint presentation by Dr. David Leslie, who is with us in the audience tonight, and his colleague, Dr. Zach Singer. And we hope to run another series in 2022 based on the success of this one. So to begin our journey back to 10,000 BC, we have with us 2 gentlemen who participated in this excavation and will share some basics with you about archaeology today. Paul Wegner is Assistant Director at the Institute for American Indian Studies in Washington, Connecticut. He's been working in the field of archaeology for over 17 years. He holds a bachelor's in anthropology from Franklin Pierce College and a master's in experimental archaeology from the University of Exeter. In addition, he serves on the board of the Archaeological Society of Connecticut and is a registered professional archaeologist. Scott M. Brady currently serves as president of the Friends of the Office of State Archaeology, FOSA. He has been a FOSA member and an avocational archaeologist since 2012, when he retired after a career with the City of Hartford. He also serves as a board member of the Archaeological Society of Connecticut. So I'd like to turn it over to Paul and Scott.
Thank you so much. I just want to say welcome to everyone. Just a big thank you to both Terry and Tina for setting this up, and a big shout out to my volunteer extraordinaire, Nancy Najarian, who also set this up and kind of connected me to both the Avon Public Library and the Historical Society. Scott and I are going to be presenting a little bit of information on what exactly archaeology is, what archaeologists do, what they don't do, and how avocational archaeology really helps to inform professional archaeology. And that's something that we really want to stress, is that a lot of times we think that archaeology is something that's not obtainable or doable by someone who's just on the street or retired or learning or reading a book about it. It's something that you have to have advanced degrees to perform, which it helps. But you can be involved in these kinds of situations and these kinds of excavations with just a little bit of your time. And that's something that Scott will discuss. So I wanted to start with a quote from a very famous archaeologist. And it says, "Archaeology is the search for fact, not truth. So forget any ideas you have about lost cities, exotic travel, digging up the world. We do not follow maps to bury treasure, and X never marks the spot." This is from the world's most famous archaeologist. You might have heard of him, Dr. Henry Jones Jr. If you don't know Dr. Henry Jones Jr., I'm going to give you a picture of him. There he is, Dr. Henry Jones Jr. He sometimes goes by his nickname, Indiana. And why I say he's the most famous archaeologist in the history of archaeology, at least in the 20th century, he's the most famous, because archaeology is within the kind of zeitgeist of popular culture. Popular culture loves archaeology. We see archaeology in shows like Oak Island, and in shows with other people from the History Channel to the Discovery Channel to the Learning Channel. All of these kind of shows promote what we would call archaeology, right? So archaeology is really embedded in popular culture, and our idea about what archaeologists do are informed by popular culture. And it's something that I will be talking about. It's something that I know Scott will be talking about as well, is this idea of what people think we do and what we actually do. And there's a big difference. So this is not to say that the popular culture and archaeology and popular culture doesn't help archaeology in a way. Harrison Ford was actually inducted to like the American Institute for Archaeology, or the Archaeology Institute of America Board of Regents or something, like 10 years ago. I don't know why, for being Indiana Jones apparently. But it can be argued that popular culture and archaeology, in a sense, fuels interest, and interest is a way that you can learn about real archaeology. So one of the things that we wanted to talk about tonight was, what do real archaeologists do if they don't fight Nazis and find holy grails and things like that? What do we do? So first is, what is the term archaeology and where does it come from? So the term archaeology comes from, oops, sorry, next slide. It comes from, this is from the Society for American Archaeology. It is the study of ancient and recent human past through material remains. And I wanted to focus on this one word, material remains. What does that mean? Well, material remains can be a lot of things. It can be scallop shell pottery. It can be kaolin pipes. It can be masks that we wore last week. And so archaeology is the study of these materials that humans leave behind. We often call these things artifacts. And I'm sure you've heard that term, and in many lectures, I'm sure that most of you who are attending this have attended some archaeological lecture at some point in your life and have heard the term artifact thrown around. These are kind of synonymous with each other: material remains, artifacts, and the term material culture. So archaeologists study these artifacts. But what is an artifact? We drop this term all the time, but what actually is it? And the definition that I'm going to be using today is an object made by a human being. We could also say that an artifact is an object that has been altered by a human being. And usually when we're talking about objects, we're talking about portable objects, smaller objects, not pyramids, things like that. Those are kind of seen as sites, not objects. So an artifact is anything that has been made or altered by a human. And what are those kind of things that we see? These are artifacts. We have an axe here. We have some polychrome pottery here. We've got some channel flakes from the Templeton site. We've got some medical masks I wore last week. These are all objects that are made by humans. And one of the things that archaeologists strive to get from these objects is, why did we make those things? How did we use those objects? What is the purpose of those objects within our culture or within our society? So how do we get those objects? I get a lot of questions related to well, the first slide related to Indiana Jones, really, saying, why are you here? Why are you working in Connecticut? Why are you working in the Northeast? You know where you should go? That's usually the first thing. If it's not dinosaurs, it's, you know where you should go? You should go to Egypt. I hear they have a lot of archaeology in Egypt. And to that I say, I imagine that they do, yes. But one of the things that we look at is how archaeologists recover artifacts are through various methods. The biggest one is through excavation, and we'll get to that in just a second. Then there's surface collecting. Surface collecting can be walking through a field that's been recently plowed, or walking through an environment or a space where someone has said, hey, I found a projectile point or an arrowhead over here when I was a kid, and I think it's something. And I said can include geophysical surveys, so we can do things like remote sensing and things like that, and saying, oh, this actually looks like it might be a very good spot to excavate. And then through outside collectors. A lot of the work that I do at the museum is through outside collectors. While the museum does a lot of excavation on its own, we have a vast number of collections within our permanent collections. And we do things like Artifact ID Day. We get a ton of people who are emailing us different artifacts that they find, different things that they found around their house. They'll come into the museum and bring objects that they found in their garden and say, is this something? Is that something? What do I have? Do I have the lost city of Atlantis, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But a lot of times that can actually lead to something that's very important. A lot of finds come from just randomness. We have within our collection, and if you ever come to the Institute for American Indian Studies located at Curtis Road in Washington, yeah, I had to plug it, you can see in one of our exhibits, we have a cache from a gentleman whose last name is Glacier. And he discovered one of the largest caches in southern New England at the time, just digging out a gully near his house that had washed out in the rain. And so that actually produced something very important to the archaeological record. So we recover artifacts in many different ways. So what is excavation? This is from the Encyclopedia Britannica. For those of you who are younger, an encyclopedia is a book that used to have information in it before the internet. So it's the exposure and recording and recovery of burial material remains. Again, going back to that term, material remains. So archaeologists expose through excavation, record, and recover those material remains through excavation. And so archaeology is a invasive type of science. This hole that we see here is never going to be exactly the same way that it was when we first started digging there. It's changed. We've removed the materials from it. We've removed the soils from it. We've taken the objects or material remains, the artifacts out of it. And when we put the soil back, it won't be in the same way. So excavation is a very invasive kind of thing. And that's one of the reasons why archaeologists have to record this immense amount of information. And we do excavation in kind of different ways. And I worked for a number of years in the cultural resource management field, something that Scott's going to mention when he talks, which is kind of what we term public archaeology. And it's the work that was done that found the Brian Jones site was through cultural resource management. And they do in various phases of excavation. And one of the ways that we find and discover sites on a larger scale is through a thing called shovel test pits, which is just a survey of shovel tests or holes, small holes, along different lines and in different grids to try and determine where the largest concentration of artifacts are. And you can see in this picture, this is from Templeton, probably in like 2016. They're doing shovel test pits in a new area that they wanted to excavate. So they had to dig really deep in these smaller holes so that they can then expand out into larger units once they've determined where the biggest concentration of artifacts are. And then we have systematic excavation, which is what we call phase 3. And that is where you see the kind of thing that you kind of always see when you see archaeology on the Discovery Channel. They have these vast open areas and excavation units. This is actually 2 separate pictures from 2 excavations at Templeton. This is Dr. Zach Singer, and this is his assistant, Chantel, in an excavation unit. I do not know who any of these people are. I put this picture in here because it shows the wide array and vast amount of excavation that's taking place at Templeton. Also, this person's outfit is incredible, and I cannot stop staring at it, so I had to put it in there. It's amazing. But so excavation is taking this huge amount of space and sifting through all of the dirt. Why are we doing that? Well, it goes back to that idea of archaeology being an invasive science. So you want to collect all of the data that you possibly can. The goal is to recreate the entire site in the lab so that you can have every piece of information that you got out of the field, because you're never ever going to be able to go back. You're never ever going to be able to go back in the dirt that you dug up. So this systematic excavation is something that is highly involved, a lot of note taking. That's something they probably don't tell you when you start field school, or if you're volunteering. They're like, yeah, come dig, you're gonna find some awesome stuff. Also, you're gonna take about 3.5 hours of notes. So it's something that's really important to do this kind of wide excavation to get an idea of where everything is. So how do we find these sites? And we kind of mentioned this a little bit before, that we have things like collectors find things. There may be DOT projects that require this, but a lot of sites are found in other ways. Through historic documents. So there may be historic documents that indicate that there was a house structure in the area. This works really well in historic archaeology. So if you're looking for a colonial building and you know that there's a colonial building there, but you don't know exactly where it is, you can look at historic documents and see where the deeds and what they say about it. Oral histories, not just like histories, but oral histories of indigenous people, oral histories of local people who've lived in the area and say, I've been collecting over here since 1932, or my grandmother used to collect artifacts over here. And a lot of times that will lead to archaeological sites. Satellite imagery. This picture is of the Giza Plateau because I wanted to talk about, when I'm talking about satellite imagery, is that there's kind of a really big push in the last 10 years to use things like satellite imagery to find archaeological sites. They're using what is called LiDAR, which uses light to bounce off of the Earth's surface from a plane or a drone, and then capture the elevation. And that actually reveals a lot of different structures that can't be seen from an aerial photograph or from the sky, or while you're on the ground. A number of Mayan archaeologists found just vast amounts of kind of inner workings and causeways and buildings in Central America using LiDAR. This example of the Giza Plateau is an archaeologist working in Egypt who has penned a book called Space Archaeology. Yes, that's a real name of a book. Used satellite imagery and LiDAR and kind of smished them together, and was able to find some causeways and roads and buildings in both the Giza Plateau area and then the city of Tanis that were unseen before, just lost kind of in the dirt, in the dust of time. And so satellite imagery is becoming a really important tool for archaeologists to find sites. And then of course, existing sites and collectors, when doing an archaeological survey, you will look for existing sites within the area, and then that can kind of give you information about what you may find. If you're working in an area and there are 180 prehistoric sites within that area, then you know you might have a good spot for finding something. And then obviously existing collectors who bring in things and say, I found something on my property, would you like to come and excavate? And then of course by accident, and you may think that's kind of funny, but it's actually has happened where your colleague is taking a lunch break and they're just like fiddling around near the base of a tree, and they're like, hey, I found something, and then it ended up being like an entire site. Yeah, completely by accident. Or someone has a tree fall over in their yard and they call you or call the state archaeologist because they found something under that tree. It ends up being a very large site. So accidents can be serendipitous in archaeology. So what happens after excavation? There's analysis and interpretation. I call this photo, everyone loves pottery, don't they? As a ceramicist, I love pottery. No matter how many piles I have to sleep in to analyze it. So analysis and interpretation are really important. Once you have that, the materials back from the site, you gather them in this very, very intense recording, and you have all of these materials back. The materials need to be processed. They are cleaned on occasion, depending on the site. A lot of modern archaeological excavations, especially ones that we do at the museum, we don't clean the artifacts in the same way that we used to. In the past, we used to have staff and volunteers wash them, like clean them. They were just spick and span clean. And we don't do that anymore because a lot of residues and a lot of science has changed in the analysis of residues and things that can be found on artifacts. And so the dirtier the objects are, or at least the more evidence that they have on them from that original site, sometimes the better they are to analyze. So they're processed, they're cataloged. In a lot of cases, they're given a number based on where they were found within an excavation unit or where they're found within a site. And then they're bagged and tagged and put away so they can be brought back as needed. One of the biggest things about archaeology is that we always want to have this ability to bring back information so that another researcher researching a similar site, researching a site in the same area, can have access to that information. What good is knowledge if it's not shared? And so the artifacts are processed. Materials that you'll see, oftentimes you'll hear people on excavations talk about the word feature. And so the word feature can be, it could be a hearth, it could be a stone structure, it could be post molds from a building or from a palisade, or something like that. And a lot of these kinds of features contain organic materials. And so those organic materials need to be saved. And so those features will be excavated and brought back, sometimes entirely intact, sometimes in pieces, but all the dirt and organic material will be brought back to the lab and processed in a different way than the artifacts will be processed. One of the ways that it's done is through a process called flotation. And I hope to have a picture up here, but I realized the museum had no pictures of us doing flotations. Hundreds of flotations and no one took a picture. I think that everyone was just floating the materials. But it basically involves putting the materials in water. The lighter materials come to the top and can be skimmed off, and the heavier sediment and dirt goes to the bottom and can be run through a various series of sieves. And then this material, both the heavy and the light, can be analyzed. And things like carbon, botanicals, fibers can be taken out from these type of flotations, and they're really, really important to analysis. So if you hear any lectures going forward in this series where they're talking about carbon dating, where they're talking about botanical analysis, where they're talking about fibers or anything that they found, a lot of times they got that through the process of flotation. And we at the museum have sent out a few objects for not only carbon dating, but residue analysis. A lot of ceramic materials will absorb residues as people were cooking them, and these residues can be pulled from the fiber and material of the pottery itself, and can reveal things like the type of food that they were boiling in those pots. And this is a fairly new process, and it's ever changing. So it's really exciting, the kind of information and material that we can now get from just a piece of pottery like that big, or just a rock this big. Get a lot of information. And you can use the information from the flotation to find out the type of plants that were local to the area, find out the type of trees that were in the area, and all of that kind of things. So I wanted to briefly touch on, since this will probably go a multitude of times, what is carbon dating? This little graphic is from Crow Canyon, which is an archaeological center out west. So the link is down there, but if you just Google Crow Canyon carbon dating, you'll come up with this. Essentially, all living beings produce carbon-14. So a plant gets carbon through the photosynthesis process. We eat the plant, or we eat the turkey that holds it. And as soon as the living thing dies, it begins to decay. And carbon has a half-life. I think it's like 5,700 something. Someone will have to correct me. I'm not a big radiocarbon guy. And it breaks down as a half-life, much like if you thought of when you have nuclear spent fuel rods, they have that half-life. So every certain number of years, the molecules break in half, and then every certain number of years, the molecules break in half, and this is measurable. And so because carbon-14 can break in half in a specific amount of years, it is measurable, and we can measure this through this carbon-14 dating method. So this is really important because this wasn't always available. It wasn't until the mid 20th century, till around the 50s, this kind of came about. I believe it was a gentleman named Whipple, if I recall, that came up with this idea. And the advances in carbon dating have only increased as the years progressed. It used to be that you needed a very large piece of carbon to have it carbon dated because they would break it down, and their machines would be unable to process it. They need a very small piece. They can do it from a very small, minute amount of carbon, which just kind of really increases the amount of data that you can get from an archaeological site. And if the carbon is saved, so if we had a site that we dug in 1973 and the carbon was saved properly, it can be analyzed again. So much as it didn't get contaminated in some way. Someone wasn't smoking near it or something like that, but who knows, it's the 70s. So this can be still giving us information. So like I said before, archaeological material retained from the site can still give us information, even decades after it has been excavated. And then other dating methods that we use is there's this principle of superposition, which I'm sure everyone listening to this has experienced or know, that the things on the upper level, this is the surface level here, are younger. And that because of the way that the earth lays down dirt and we lay down dust in these kind of stratigraphic layers in stratigraphy, the younger stuff is on top and the older stuff is on the bottom. And we can use this to date objects in a way. It's not a particular date. We can't say that this whole entire stratigraphy is 5,200 years ago, and everything found in that stratigraphy is 5,200 years ago. It's all relative. And this can be succumb to things like little chipmunks burrowing inside, can ruin that by moving objects. They've been noted that worms can move a vast amount of dirt and objects between stratigraphic layers. But this is a really good way to get a general idea of hey, we found this portion of the site and this portion of the site. And with sites like the Brian G. Jones site and Templeton, these very old sites, we see deep deposits where not only do you have the layers of the existing time period, but you have the layers that came on that, and then alluvial layers that just came washing and floods and floods and floods and floods, creating very deep layers. And that's why the excavations for these types of sites go very deep. And we're only kind of discovering now that perhaps in the past we didn't dig deep enough, that there actually might be sites where we thought they had ended. There might actually be older sites. Something that we are actually looking into at the museum currently, looking at a couple of excavations from the 1980s, which may indicate that they have older deposits and older kind of living areas that are perhaps even Paleo-Indian that were never excavated. So this superposition is really important for getting kind of a relative date. Then we have this idea of seriation, or using different types of objects. This graph is on pottery in the southern New England. This is from Dr. Lucy Ann Lavin. Yeah, it's just an amazing kind of chronology of pottery and how it's changed over time. If I was going to give an analogy of what seriation is, I would say that seriation, if you think of cars and how they've changed over time, if you think of the Chevy Nova, it was an awesome muscle car, and then in the 80s it was this little like thing of a car that completely changed, that didn't represent this awesome muscle car, and then as it kind of progressed, it changed into wanting to be an awesome muscle car again, right? And we can see this progression, we can see this change over time in everything that humans produce. And knowing specific dates, so if we had a carbon date here, and we had a carbon date here, and we had a carbon date here, we can see the progression through time and relate these objects to each other within specific time frames. And using things like typology, which is saying that all of these objects present specific types of attributes and therefore are related to each other, we can put them in this type of chronology. And it helps out that humans really like to change things over time and really like to be stylistic. Unfortunately, if humans were just making very plain ceramic vessels all the time and never changed and never added any decoration, it would be really difficult to do any kind of like chronology based on type. But lucky for us, humans like decoration in everything that they do. So these are just kind of some of the methods that archaeologists use to kind of discover in what time period objects come from. And as I said before, this is a really kind of basic idea about how archaeologists work, but the last thing is interpretation. And I didn't really want to get into too much interpretation because I wanted Scott to talk a lot about the sites that he was going to be talking about, because they're really awesome and they kind of relate to this idea of interpretation. But obviously, once you analyze all the objects, once you procure all the evidence, you interpret that evidence to discover how people in the past lived. And then hopefully, with any luck, you present that evidence to your peers, to the public, and you get that information out. And there are numerous publications. And one of the things that I did want to make a note of is that in that interpretation, it is interpretation. It's our idea of how these materials were used during that time period. And interpretation changes over time as we gather new means of getting information, and as we get new knowledge, as new archaeological sites are discovered, interpretation changes. And so the way that someone interprets something in the 1860s may not be the way that someone interpreted the same site in the 1960s, and may not be the way that someone interprets the same site in 2060. So interpretation is both related to information, but it's also very subjective. And I threw in some pictures of some publications where archaeologists present their materials. Louis Binford being a very famous American archaeologist, who had some very interesting ideas about archaeology. And then I threw in this across the Atlantic guys, just, for my Paleo-Indian guys, just to mess with them. So all of this being said, is not just done by archaeologists in the professional field. The work that the Institute for American Indian Studies did and does in archaeology, and the work that a lot of the state archaeologists throughout the United States do, is completely aided and almost entirely dependent on avocational volunteers working with them to complete these projects. Without them, it would be nearly impossible to recover the vast amounts of information and materials that need to be recovered and processed in even just one archaeological site. And with that, I did want to pass this over to Scott, who's going to be talking about avocational archaeology, his role in avocational archaeology, and how avocational archaeologists really help and have a good time and things like that in helping to help learn about the deep buried past of the United States. So Scott?
Thank you, Paul. You did the hard part. Now I get to take it home with a few sites that people might be interested in. Okay. All right. So who's Scott Brady and why are you listening to him here? This is kind of proof that avocational archaeologists come from all over. I worked for the Hartford Fire Department for a long time and retired in 2012. Participated in a 1 week, participated in a 1 week field school that was run by the Connecticut Museum of Natural History, is now run by the Office of State Archaeologist. I got really involved and joined the Friends of the Office of State Archaeology, which is a nonprofit that supports the state archaeologist. State archaeologist is basically an office of one. So there's not a huge budget. There's not a staff for them to go out and do archaeological work. And one of the things that I am also enjoying during this is I am researching the pig pen effect. That is me in two different places, and I'm the filthiest person at both that fire and on that archaeological site. So I still haven't figured out how I can get out of the car and look like that. Oops. There we go. Just real quickly to show that there's been a long history of avocationals, and I apologize to German and Greek, those of you of German or Greek ancestry, because I'm probably going to butcher both these names. Here are two pretty famous avocational archaeologists from the 1800s. On the bottom, you have Minos Koloneros, who he was a Greek businessman. He was the first to undertake excavations on the Bronze Age site of Knossos on Crete. So a very important site. Did a really good job with some fine archaeology there. Above him, you have Heinrich Schlesselmann, another German businessman and banker, who discovered a site in Turkey, which we now presume to be the site of ancient Troy. He used dynamite to excavate the site. So again, there's variations within the community of avocationals about how well they're thought of. You want to come down on the side of Minos and not of Heinrich. And that's why you want to really understand how the archaeological process is supposed to work. So as Paul mentioned, that information that is available in the site that will be destroyed with its excavation can be fully captured so that site can be recreated. I mean, you want to be able to say where every object came from in space and time, and that requires a lot of the documentation that Paul was talking about. So Connecticut avocational organizations, really you started to see them in the 50s and 70s, and they've gone right through until today. They were popular in the United States, and Connecticut was no different. Most of the Connecticut organizations are kind of based loosely on geographic region. There's a number of them here. The Archaeological Society of Connecticut, which is still active, had a number of chapters. Albert Morgan, Greater New Haven, Arthur Bastro, which was, I believe, down in the New London area. Litchfield Hills Archaeology Club, still associated with the Institute for American Indian Studies. Friends of the Office of State Archaeology, which was started in '87, and Norwalk Community College Archaeology Club. So a lot of avocationals have been out there organizing, I think in large part to perform archaeology on a more consistent and scientific basis than they were able to do alone. Now, the two archaeological types in my mind, and archaeologists with degrees might differ with my assessment here, but Paul talked about cultural resource management, or CRM. That's almost exclusively professional archaeologists and crews of professional archaeologists. They are, again, are almost exclusively used on projects where there's state or federal funding and where local regulations require archaeological assessment, inventory, and preservation. That's a very small percentage of what happens in the state of Connecticut, or anywhere actually. So state or federal funding, I mean, you're looking at highways, public buildings. Most localities in Connecticut, I think there's 169 cities and towns. I believe less than a third of them have an archaeological requirement in their planning and zoning codes. And the degree of what they require for a project is very different. So there's a lot going on, whether it's building, construction, and all kinds of other things that don't get a CRM professional crew on the scene to perform archaeology. And my definition of avocational archaeology is everything else: historic groups, clubs, academic research, field schools, and private citizen requests. I look at field school students, even if they're at a university, most of them come out, take a field school. A lot of them are not necessarily archaeology majors. They might be soc or anthro majors, and they might have some interest in archaeology, or they might just go, hey, 5 weeks in summer and I get a 5-week credit course. So they're not really coming at it the same way as a professional. They're coming at this much more like an avocational, learning under the oversight of a professional archaeologist. And then within the actual archaeological community, we have people, there's a couple Cub Scouts there in the bottom working on their little excavation. So from young kids, senior citizens, retirees, degree holders, non-degree holders, it's a very wide array of people that are participating as avocationals. So what do avocationals do? What do they participate in from an archaeological perspective? Well, they participate in the remote sensing, the geographic information systems. So they might help with ground penetrating radar, magnetometry. They're not analyzing the data that those surveys produce, but if you look in the bottom right on your screen, you could see that that magnetometer is being walked on a line on a grid. And to give them a straight line to walk, you might be one of the people holding the rope at either end. Not the most glamorous job, but it actually makes a difference in how that information is collected and the reliability of that information. In the middle, there's ground penetrating radar, and you can see some of the blue flags that are stuck on the ground. Same thing. They would build a grid to help guide them in their oversight, guide the machinery over the topsoil in nice, straight, consistent lines so that they could get good data on what was below the surface. Up on the top left, that's just an excavation. And that's kind of what most people think of when they think of getting involved in archaeology. And certainly many of our members participate that way, and it's the part that they enjoy the most. And then lastly, down in the lower left, that's a couple of FOSA members in the lab at UConn, cataloging, sorting, and cleaning the artifacts that we've deemed are acceptable to be cleaned. Paul is very right that there's much more science that's available on an uncleaned artifact if you're looking at proteins and use wear and a number of other investigations that can be performed on artifacts. So what people think archaeologists find is pretty much what you see on this page, right? They have all kinds of crazy stuff. The first question I've been asked most times when I ask people, or when people find out I work alongside the state archaeologist and volunteer in that office, is, are there any more dinosaur bones, and how many times have you found dinosaur bones here in Connecticut? So archaeologists don't find dinosaur bones unless it's a really fortuitous accident. There were no people and dinosaurs at the same time. That's why they're not particularly interested in dinosaur bones. You could find some of the megafauna perhaps that existed in timeframes where there are people and those types of animals on the landscape. And human bones, we should talk about a little bit too. The modern, or the most current, idea on human remains is that archaeologists generally tend to want to leave them in place as a sign of respect for those individuals, unless there's some compelling reason that they cannot stay there. They'll be destroyed. And I've seen where DOT, for instance, in putting a roadway, or a town putting in a school, will move that project, will move that roadway a couple hundred yards one way or the other, move that building or parking lot to a different area in order to preserve an area where there's suspected or known human remains as a respectful gesture. There are times when those remains need to be removed. I think probably the most recent that some of the listeners might have heard about was the discovery of some human remains out in Ridgefield. An individual was doing some work in their cellar and uncovered these human remains, which you can't leave people in someone's cellar. So state archaeologist Dick Bellantoni went out there, removed the remains, and where he's exploring the thesis that though they are potentially, or hypothesis, I'm sorry, that they are potentially involved in the Battle of Ridgefield during the Revolutionary War. So it's a really interesting project. But we don't find treasure, we don't find crowns, we don't find big vases. For every King Tut's tomb, for every great cache of blades that Paul talked about earlier, with all those fluted points down here that were found, those are really great products. People don't throw away good stuff. People get rid of stuff that's broken, old, out of use, worn out, doesn't help them anymore. So what do archaeologists really find? This is more like what an archaeologist would find. And we'd be very excited to see all this. These chips are the exact same material that vase was. And by understanding the ceramic types and looking at the glazes and patterns, and if you're lucky enough to get a maker's mark, you can figure out that it was maybe that complete vase, or at least something very similar. We find broken pipes. That there was a kettle in the picture before. This is a kettle that was found at the Hollister site, and you can see it doesn't look anything like the one that like a whole kettle, but it's been in the ground. It was discarded because it wasn't useful anymore, and that's what it would look like. Here's a bunch of bones. The bones that most archaeologists are dealing with now are going to be food remains. Okay, they're going to be what were people eating, which is a really important thing, especially in pre-European contact times. You know, we're going back 12,000 years. What were people eating? What animals were available to them? So that's a really important thing. We find lots of nails and window glass on pretty much every site in Connecticut. And then for every point that someone makes, and most archaeologists will use the term projectile point instead of arrowhead, the reason being that these points were used for a number of things. They were used as knives and other tools. They went on spears, they went on darts, they went on arrows. The bow and arrow, there's a fairly common belief amongst most archaeologists that in North America, we're not really seeing bow and arrow till about 1,500 years ago. And even if it's several thousand years before that, we have 12,000 years of people here and a bow and arrow for a much shorter period of time. So we would say projectile point. So if you're making a point or a blade or an arrowhead, and you're taking that stone and you're chipping it, you're going to make a lot of flakes or a lot of little tiny pieces before you get to that finished product that you started with a bigger piece of stone. Now, most of the time, the flakes that I would expect to see in most places here would be much smaller than that. These are a number of giant chert flakes, which this is Brian Jones' hand holding them. They came off a site in Rocky Hill, little subdivision, and turned out to be an archaic encampment where there was a huge amount of reduction of Norman skill chert. This is in Rocky Hill. The chert comes from New York, so you're bringing stones a long way. And what it looked like here is they were reducing them to preforms, so making it into the basic shape of the tool that they wanted to eliminate some of that waste and weight that they were carrying around. Now, this is what a real artifact assemblage is going to look like in the field. A lot different from what most people think of. There's the window glass, there's all kinds of broken ceramics. And the artifacts that they are looking at right now are from one 50 by 50 centimeter quadrant. So when archaeologists excavate, most of the time we're going to go with a meter square. And we're going to dig in to control that and measure that in from a known point so we can, again, locate objects on the site and at the depth. We're going to do that. We're going to then take that 1 meter quad or 1 meter square and break it into 4 different quadrants: the northeast, northwest, southeast, and southwest. And then we're going to excavate each of those quadrants in a layer, a depth layer. Generally speaking, you'd see about 10 centimeters, about 4 inches in a layer. If you look at that and start thinking there's 4 of those in every 4 inches, that's an awful lot of material that has to be collected in the field, pre-sorted, and documented as to where it came from. And avocationals everyone in that picture is an avocational archaeologist. So they're all out volunteering because they have an interest in archaeology. And now I'm going to talk about some of the avocational contributions. How do avocationals actually get involved, and what kind of sites do they contribute information on? This one's a really interesting one. This is Lee West here. Lee West is a member of the Friends group. He's also a member of the ASC. He is not a trained archaeologist. He lives in a 1750 colonial home. And what happened was he wanted to do some work in the backyard and knew that there had been structures out there during the time, since the house was built in 1750, was able to get an idea that there might be an anomaly or a space that looked different than it should. And that was with ground penetrating radar, and he excavated it. You could see what he found was a trash pit from the early 20th century, which they determined was pretty much filled in before 1920. And on the bottom right, you could see the numerous medicinal bottles, mostly for headache cures and upset stomach medicines, that Sarah Isabella Bell Robbins used. Because in 1920, again, it's not just necessarily the excavation, there's research and then interpretation. Lee was able to find the census record from 1920. There's only one person living in the house. It's Sarah. She's an elderly woman. And I think it's a pretty good conclusion that it's likely that those bottles and those medicines were used by her. This is really unusual because putting the name to someone in archaeology is really, really unique. a lot of times what archaeologists are doing, or all the time, is telling stories. But sometimes those stories are of a very broad-based nature. So what were all the Paleo people doing here in southern New England? What were the colonial people doing in a relationship with Native Americans in 1650? You almost never get down into these individual kind of personal stories. And I think those are some of the favorite of all the sites I've worked on, when we can get a personal story like that. Avocational contributions, the Lieutenant John Hollister site. It's 1650 to 1730. The Hollister family, pretty well-known and important family in Hartford, lived on that site. Now that we're looking at it a little closer, I think that the new state archaeologist, Sarah Sportman, and I have been kind of discussing her thoughts that there may be a pre-1650 component at that site, which would be pretty amazing, because this is in South Glastonbury, just across the river from Wethersfield. At the time this site was occupied, it was part of Wethersfield, and Wethersfield is only settled in 1634. So to have a pre-1650 European component is pretty interesting, and we're hopeful that we can do some more excavations out there to find out about it. The excavation started in 2015. They went on through Brian's death in 2019, and the state archaeologist at the time was Brian Jones. He left us he loved this site. He left us instructions on what we were supposed to do in 2019, even though he had passed away. And we were happy to go out there and work on the site and in his memory. And again, at the bottom picture, all avocational archaeologists in that. And the left part, this black and white thing, is the ground penetrating radar. We were talking about, and here's the horses running the ground penetrating radar. We're talking about using FOSA volunteers or avocational volunteers to help collect data that can then be processed in ground penetrating radar. This is one of Brian's favorite pictures. And you could see, I think I outlined them on the next one. You could see these very obvious rectangular features, which turned out to be refilled cellar holes, we're calling them. This one's kind of mucky over here. We weren't quite sure what was going on here. These were two wells. And this turned into be another two cellars. There's now 6 cellars that have been identified and at least tested on that site. So it's a very important, very early site. So the findings, what kind of discoveries do avocationals help make? And in this case, we found lots and lots of faunal, okay? So the domestic animals that Europeans brought with them. We did find bones and teeth for relating to cows and sheep and pigs. But in all the samples that we've analyzed so far, and there's a lot more we would like to do with the faunal remains from there, we have a much larger sample of wild game than we do of those domestic animals. So we see thousands and thousands of fish scales. We see turtle bones and shell. We see small mammal bones, lots of deer bones, bird bones, other game. Which is really interesting because, again, now we're trying to interpret this. There's some very early sites in Wethersfield that suggest that those people in that center area in town, where this site is kind of on the outskirts of what would be civilization, I guess, at that point, those people in town are eating much more of the domestic animals than they are the wild games. So again, that's a very interesting discovery. Botanically, there's carbonized maize and beans, which is kind of what we would expect. Although they put this, the crops that the Europeans family, the Hollisters, and before them, the tenant farmers that were there planted, they went very quickly to a lot of European style pies and grains, an apple orchard. We see a lot of shell. This is a nice whole one, but normally the shell that we find is in pieces. And this I threw in because I love it. This is a bear toe bone or foot bone. So there's at least one bear that somehow was included in butchered at the Hollister site. Again, at the Hollister site, this is one that always amazes me. This is, to me, the most exciting thing that we have found at the Hollister site, and most archaeologists are like, yeah, okay. So early on, if you had glass windows, you didn't have a big pain, right? To get glass across the ocean and then on a wagon across the Connecticut River to a home on a dirt road required the glass that you were moving to be cut into small little panes called whorls. And so you would lead it together. So you make stained glass, basically windows with clear glass. So here's that leading that we found there. And here are two pieces of the glass whorls, a slightly different shape than these, but here's two pieces of that glass. This, you can see it's cut to this exact shape. This is a sheet of mica. And that's what I was excited about. Mica being used to replace the glass that got broken. And I've talked to many archaeologists about it, and I said that. And they go, oh, yeah, they used to do that. And I've always asked, well, have you ever found proof of it? And no one ever has. At least to my knowledge, this is the first time in New England, maybe anywhere, where we've actually found the mica cut to be a glass replacement. So I thought that was pretty cool. More at the Hollister, and I'm going back through time. I promise you I'll get to some of the paleo stuff that I think a lot of the listeners are interested in. We found all kinds of pins. This is a tatting needle. It's used for making lace. This is a straight pin. It might even have been a hairpin or a dress pin. Here's a little tiny thimble. I mean, it is the smallest thimble I've ever seen. Again, this is not surprising to find these kinds of artifacts at on a colonial site. A lot of women were making lace, and what you would use these tag needles for, just kind of supplement their income. It was kind of a cottage industry. Where I thought this kind of really got interesting is sometimes the archaeology can help you confirm a story, and sometimes it helps you dismiss a story. Real quickly, I'll tell you one that it dismissed. We did the Deerfield Massacre up in Massachusetts. They have a monument, and the history that came down with it is this is where all the victims of the Deerfield Massacre, when the Native Americans came down, raided Deerfield, took captives, and went back up to Canada, are buried. We used, I was allowed to go up there and assist Nick Bellantoni, the state archaeologist for here in Connecticut, went up with two GPR experts from the USDA that we work with. And they're very careful in the opinions that they give, especially when we're out there just performing the data and it hasn't been analyzed. But they took us to this site, we ran the GPR, and they were really hoping that the people were going to be buried there in a mass grave. And the lead GPR expert turned and said, well, I can tell you one thing, there isn't anybody buried here. So again, a little disappointing for them, but now they know that there's another story to be told and they need to do some more work. Here, we may have confirmed a story. In the Hollister record, there's a narrative that talks about the Hollisters had this young Native girl that they were teaching how to sew. I was always a little surprised about that because, I mean, sewing's not really that complicated. Native people were sewing skin and, other materials and weaving. So I was a little surprised that, there would be a documented piece about teaching sewing, even if they were teaching her to sew European style cloth or textiles. But I see that tatting needle and it makes me think maybe they were teaching this girl lace making, which would require a little bit more of an investment of time. And again, a little personal story, very small thimble. She's supposed to be a very young girl, and that tatting needle. We can't say that's what happened but it sure is interesting that those things seem to be aligning. Again, the native component at the Hollister site, we found, this is a time period where there's a lot of fear. There's a lot of fear in the European community against that the natives are going to throw them off the land. And they probably had the opportunity to at some points. Even within the native community, there's some tensions between the different tribal groups. But here at Hollister, we see something that tells a little bit of a different story for at least a brief period of time. We have all these trade beads. We have this native pottery. I've been doing archaeology since 2012. I had found, before I went to Hollister, one piece of native pottery, probably about the size of this shell. There's a little fragment. Here in one cellar that I worked in, we took over 40 or 50 pieces this size. So, and we can see here, we've started to refit some of it. So we found what we basically have identified as three different storage vessels of Native American design and materials in the cellars of the Hollister house holds. To me, that implies there's some kind of trade relationship that would most likely have been beneficial to both sides. Again, more Native American artifacts. We see this little piece of brass. These punched pieces of brass were often worn as amulets by Native American peoples. The Wangunk would have been the local tribe. And here's a flint. This is European flint. It's a gun flint, but it's snapped in a way that suggests it was made by a Native person. So that potentially puts Native people within the Hollister encampment over in what's then Weathersfield. And this is really, really unique. This is native pottery with slip on it and then decorated with linear lines. Very, very unusual. There's not many pieces known in Connecticut at all. So they have some kind of really interesting relationship with the Native peoples. This is another quick archaeological excavation that came up. Sometimes they're not planned, right? This was a construction project that somehow had not been lined up by the to do archaeological excavation and research before they started. And what we found was a late Archaic encampment, about 4,800 to 4,200 years before present. That's on 6 radiocarbon dates. It's a rescue or salvage operation by the state archaeologist, Brian Jones. That's him in the center. Here we are working it. Here's the machine. We're working both sides of this trench that they're making. And what are we finding? We're finding that this landform has been stuck there for at least 5,000 years, which is really interesting because most of us know that rivers meander and wander, and something has protected that area from South Glastonbury, probably from about the bridge, the Putnam Bridge down. And that landform is a relic from at least the Archaic period of over 5,000 years ago. What we found there was earth ovens, which I'll show you a picture of in a minute, and a possible house floor. We had artifacts that this adze down here, beautifully pecked adze, could be used for working wood, could be used as a hoe, and narrow stem points, these little narrow stem quartz points, a local material. Here's a cobble that was probably broken to create a point. Here's a piece of chert. Again, this material is not local, so that implies there's some kind of trading going on between the people that are living there at this time. And this is a paint pot. And we'll take another picture. You have another picture. So here's a couple of earth ovens. And you can see when most of us start doing archaeology, especially us avocationals, we're very, very interested in the things, the artifacts. And I think as we get more experience, we start to understand that the features can tell us way more, and they're way harder to find than artifacts. So you can see that there's this really, really charcoaly section down at the bottom, and that's bark that has been charred. Then there's these different colorations. This red coloration is probably heated soil. And then there's more material and carbon in here. And this one's really, really dark. So these are probably earth ovens. They would dig a pit. They would put coals in it and embers. They would put material that they wanted to process, cook in them, cover them, and sort of like the idea of a luau, pig roast kind of a concept. And then they could return and retrieve the material in here. This here is that paint pot in situ. Really neat. There's a red ochre material, really red stained material. Hang on one second. So this was really kind of neat. I had never seen one found. This was found by one of the FOSA volunteers. The Templeton site, and I know there was a question before on what is the Templeton site and where is it? The Templeton site is another Paleo-Indian site. This one's a little bit younger than the Jones site, I believe, and I'm sure Zach will correct me if I'm wrong. The carbon dates kind of support about a 10,100, 10,200 year old site. It's really interesting because it's stratified, and we'll talk about that in a minute. The excavations were done in the 70s by Roger Moeller with the Institute for American Indian Studies. They were restarted in the 2010s by Dr. Zach Singer, working with the Institute, and Dr. Kaz Scarlata at Westcon. And here is, there was a great picture of a whole bunch of channel flakes. So this is kind of what we're finding. This is a big find out there. This is great. This is a nice big channel flake. So again, a channel flake is if you finished your point and you had it all made, and then you took it at the base and you took a big flake off of it through the middle, and you did that on both sides to thin it. Some people think it was to make hafting easier. I don't know that there's a real definitive accepted answer on why they were doing that, but it's a very indicative of a paleo point. Now over here, this is Zach, and this is Kaz, and this is the base. You can see these rocks down here, these cobbles, big rocks. Those are deposited probably by the glacier. As the glacier retreats off Connecticut, it's leaving this glacial till, it's called, and these big chunky rocks. And then soil starts to build up over it. And you can see there's 5 feet of earth over this. And one of the things that I think is really interesting is that apparently it must have been a National Geographic or something, because I've heard other people say the same thing that I came to archaeology, this erroneous kind of statement that I came to archaeology with. And the thought is that every 100 years you deposit an inch of soil. Well, if this is 10,000 years old, that's not even close to how many inches of soil. And it's true that, the organic, and I think the thought there is you have trees and leaves and grasses and all these materials, and the animals that live on them will fall down onto the ground. They'll convert to soil, and it's going to build up and get higher and higher in every single year. That would be true perhaps if there was no removal of soil. So when a tree falls and now returns to the soil, other plants grow and start to remove those nutrients and remove that soil from the ground. So ideally, a lot of the places in Connecticut, when you stand on that land surface, it's going to be very close to what was the land surface was 12,000 years ago or 10,000 years ago. The areas where it's different is where you're going to have a lot of deposition or removal. And deposition is going to come primarily through windblown or water or borne sediments. In this case, we're right in the conjunction of two streams, a river and a stream, and this landform has flooded over many, many times. So all this sediment that's been built up here, almost 5 feet, has been in different flood events over 10,000 years. And what's really great about this, it's very important, this site and the Jones site, because they are stratified. A lot of paleo sites that have been found, especially in New England and southern New England, northern New England, all the way up to the maritime provinces, are not stratified. So paleo material can be mixed up with material that is nowhere near as old, might be 2,000 years old. And so it makes it much harder to interpret what you're finding, to confirm that all this material that you're finding is in fact from the Paleo period. So it's really important, these two sites in Connecticut that are deeply buried, because we start off here, and that's today. We got down to about here, and there was a woodland component, which is, you know, several thousand years ago, and then there's nothing, and then we get down here and we find all these paleo artifacts, and that's very similar to what was found at the Brian D. Jones site in Avon. So very important. I don't think that many people would have thought that these sites still existed, and Paul alluded to that. There's going to be some, I think, there's going to be, I think, a lot of archaeologists to start to look at these sites that are close to these flood areas and maybe relook and dig much deeper and find that there are a lot more paleo sites than we are aware of. Oh, I wanted to go, I'm going the wrong way. Uh-oh. Sorry about that. Should have done it that way, huh? I don't want to go too much further. I don't want to take all the steam out of what Dave and Zach Singer are going to talk about. These are crazily important sites, and I think that the two of them are a little bit modest about how important those sites are in the research on Paleo-Indian peoples, the first peoples that are coming into this area after the glacier is retreating. I think that those sites will be looked at for many, many years, and I'm really looking forward to all the things that they're going to add to the Paleo-Indian story here in the U.S. I'd like to thank the Avon Library, the Senior Center, the Farmington Bank, all the groups that made this series possible. I'd like to thank the Friends Group, the Office of State Archaeology, and most important, since Brian's death, I always end my every presentation remembering him. This is not a picture of Brian doing archaeology, but I think those that know him knew that that kind of fits his personality. That's Brian. That's his son Tristan with him. I think it's a great loss for most of us in the archaeological community, whether we're avocationals or professionals. He was a friend and a mentor to so many of us, and I'm thankful that I was able to come here and present to you this evening. And I'd be happy to take questions if there are any.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Our first question, just to clarify, this Templeton site is where? Because first I answered one way and I think I was wrong, so I had to correct it. So can you clarify where the Templeton site is?
Yeah, it's in Washington, Connecticut. It's actually not far from the Institute. So it's near the New York line in Washington, Connecticut, and at the conjunction of a stream and a little river.
Okay, fantastic.
That's the Chappaq River, and it's literally like 5 minutes away from the Institute. Yeah.
Are there the next question really ties to Avon in terms of are there any other Paleo-Indian sites located near or around Avon? And the question seems to be the context of Avon, I guess, in terms of New England is really, are there other areas that we have found Paleo-Indian sites?
I would say not a lot, no. But that's probably something that that Zach and Dr. Leslie can answer a little bit better.
Mm-hmm.
I would say, like something that Scott was mentioning, the stratification of sites is really important. So yeah, we have a lot of paleo materials, and we have sites throughout New England where there's like a base of a point here, and you know, Joe Bob found one in his field over here, but it's not not in the same way that these two sites have the vast amount of information that they have available from them. But that's yet to be determined. You know, maybe Joe Bob's Field is the next Paleo-Indian site. We don't know.
Okay. The next question is, local indigenous cultures consider their landscape and culture as sacred, with a value system our society doesn't share. How do archaeologists approach respecting the beliefs of the cultures being studied as they do their work?
That's a really good question. So one of the ways that we can do that is by involving indigenous people, working on these sites and involving indigenous people whose tribal homelands might be in the area or who are just in Connecticut. Both federally recognized tribes, Mohegan and Mashantucket Pequot, have field schools. Both of them have integrated these field schools and field work with using both professional and tribal archaeologists, working together with non-Indigenous and Indigenous archaeologists to create site excavations that kind of use the same, that work on the same site, but with two different kind of perspectives, if that makes sense. So yeah, one of the, just kind of being inclusive as much as possible, and believing oral histories. There was in the past, there was this idea that Indigenous oral histories, they didn't know what they were talking about. You know, their great-grandmother's great-grandmother told them that people lived here, and they were like, no. And that's been proven wrong. That oral history is deep, deep, deep history, and it's a deep knowledge. For example, Aboriginal Indigenous people of Australia can actually, through oral history, date themselves back to the time they went and reached Australia, like 70,000 years ago. So part of that inclusion is believing oral history and listening to Indigenous people. And most CRM firms now, when working, use like tribal historic preservation officers and have liaisons that come out to sites and things like that, that work with them.
Yeah, and I don't want to speak on behalf of the state archaeologist, but I've had the opportunity now to work with 3 state archaeologists, Nick Bellantoni, Brian, and Sarah Sportman. And I know that, you know, any time that they were involved with a project that potentially involved a native site, they always sort of reached out and inquired and made the tribes aware of what kinds of things, especially if it appeared to be, you know, a long-term occupation site with perhaps burials or other ceremonial landscapes associated with it. They've, I think, spent a lot of time cultivating relationships with the tribe. And I think most of those relationships have been very good most of the time. You can't always be wrong, but I think that those relationships have worked out really well for both the tribes and for archaeology in the state.
Excellent. Our next question is, where in Connecticut can we find the most sites? And perhaps another way to approach the question would be, are there areas in Connecticut that are more concentrated in one time period versus another?
I don't know what Scott would answer, but I would say possibly not in one time period or another, but and my answer to be, where would we find anywhere that you live, someone else probably lived, because colonial people occupied indigenous land and used the land for similar reasons. So they wanted to be near fresh water, near food sources, near places that were out of the wind. And colonial people often stole kind of roots and lands. Think of like a lot of roots in New England used to be native pathways that were then turned into colonial roads that would then turn into major routes. So where specifically, I don't want to say everywhere because that's be wrong and incorrect, but almost any place where you think would be a good place to live would be a good place to find materials. That being said, don't go digging up Connecticut. Go volunteer at FOSA. go volunteer at some other place and dig up with the help of an archaeologist.
No, that's a fantastic.
Yeah, no, and that's important, and like Paul talked about, that collector information is important. And, but the least obtrusive collector is the one that's doing a field collection, right? They go to John's farm and they walk behind the tractor after it's plowed and they get the material, and hopefully they are documenting it and reporting it to the local historical society or the Office of State Archaeology, so that if there's something significant, that additional research can be done. And as to where people lived, I think if the ideal place is somewhere close to water. So the same things that draw us to, guy wants a view of the lake or the stream or the pond. Those are places that native peoples, the first Europeans here, and even today, we all want to live in a place like that. So if you look at that piece of land, I think, as Paul said, and go, I'd like to live here, there's probably at least one component of a site and maybe several different time periods that it's been occupied.
Okay. Our next question is, do we have any sites that indicate an African presence?
In the sense, is like a colonial African presence, or like someone coming from Africa pre-European colonization?
They didn't specify, so you could answer really either way or both.
Okay, I would say first off, in a pre-European colonization, I don't believe there's any evidence that anyone came from the African continent here. In a post-colonial concept, yes, absolutely. Connecticut was a colonial state in America, and people owned slaves here, and so there are numerous sites. One of the biggest and well known is in East Haddam. The freed slave named Venture Smith owned a very large piece of property there along the Salmon River, and excavations have been done there by CRM Group and others. CRM Group that was run by Dr. Lucianne Lavin and Dr. Mark Banks worked on that property. And there's actually a State Historic Preservation Office booklet about the excavation at Venture Smith's homestead and the work that was done there. And I was lucky enough to work for that CRM firm and excavate at that property. So there's a lot of I would say post-colonial African presence here, and a lot of post-colonial Native American and African presence in various sites throughout Connecticut.
Okay.
Yeah, I would add a couple sites that I thought were kind of interesting. The lighthouse site in Barkhamsted, that was I believe it's in Barkhamsted, that was done by Kenny Fetter from Central, was a really kind of a self-sustaining community that had a lot of freed African peoples, Native Americans, sort of a marginalized community that kind of built their own kind of life and village. So that's a really cool site, and there's been some really interesting archaeology that Ken did. I think he's actually republishing his book on that site soon with an update. So that's something people might want to look for if they're interested in that. And then right now, I know the state archaeologist is looking at a project that might involve Caesar Peters out in Putnam, who's another freed African-American slave. And he was freed, built a home, did very well for himself. And so that's an interesting project that we hope comes up, sometime soon.
Tina, if I can just interject, this is Terry.
Sure.
Both of you mentioned upcoming speakers we have. Ken Fader is going to be in May, and he's going to be talking about the Farmington River, the digs that he's done all along this region and in this area, and the excavations that have been done there. And then Dr. Lucianne Lavin, who wrote the book of the Connecticut Indigenous Peoples, is going to be our September speaker, and she's going to cover quite a lot of what you all are talking about, as well as the indigenous people from probably the beginning of this Paleo period up to present, because there was certainly an awful lot of people here over the course of 10, 12,000 years, and we just don't, she has done the book on a lot of them. So that's great. So you're mentioning all of our upcoming speakers. So those of you still with us, please sign on to the whole series, because you'll be hearing them. And then our next event will be with Howard Wrights, who's going to talk about the geology of this region, which is really fascinating. And you need to really know about the rifts in this area, how the river was formed. And really, this is probably why some of the folks came here and worked here, because of what they found here. And when you find out that there's certain things on one side of the mountain, then the other side of the mountain, you're going to be kind of surprised. So that's worth it. I just had to give a plug for all that, because you've been naming all of our guests for this year. So thank you very much.
It's a great lineup.
Yeah.
Yes.
And everyone who's attended tonight will get a link with the recording for this, and they will also get a link to sign up for the rest of the series, and they will get a link to the organizations mentioned by both of our presenters today. So you can just sit back and relax. We will send everything right to your inbox. So just, can you guys leave us with a final thought before we log off for the evening? Could you tell us perhaps what your favorite part of archaeology is?
Scott?
I mean, I think I kind of said it. It's the story, right? It's the story. For me, I still haven't lost the fascination with whether something that's 50 years old or 10,000 years old. When I find an artifact, I'm the first person to see that since another human left it. And, from 12,000 to, like I said, to 50 years, there's something, for me, something special about that. I love museums. I love to look at things in display cases, but to find it and touch it and be the first person is to me the best part of doing archaeology.
Fantastic. And Paul?
Well, I would kind of agree with Scott. I think of like excavation units like little windows into the past, and we often are kind of displaced from the past, and we don't think of people in the past. You go to a museum and you see objects and you're like, that's cool, they made stuff, but you don't, when you engage with it through archaeology, there's a real connectivity. You're like, oh wow, someone really took a long time to make this object, and you can feel a connection to other humans, because like Scott said, it's really about the story and about the humans who made those in the past, and how we can tell their story.
Fantastic. It's an inspirational note to end on. So on behalf of the Avon Historical Society, the Avon Free Public Library, and the Avon Senior Center, I want to tell both of you, thank you for spending your evening with us and giving us a solid foundation with which to launch this series. I hope you will be our guests for the rest of it. And I just thank you for joining us this evening.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much.
All right.
Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Good night.